So, good afternoon, everybody. As I have already explained, Professor Ketelaar, that I will be speaking in Portuguese. So, now switching to Portuguese. Boa tarde a todos. Nós vamos então dar início a esta segunda sessão do seminário Repensar o Arquivo. E eu passo já a palavra aos dois principais organizadores, o Abel Rodrigues e a Filipa Lopes, que vão respectivamente apresentar o seminário e apresentar o professor Ketelaar. Agradeço a todos a vossa presença. I thank you everybody for the presence and I wish you a very good afternoon, working afternoon. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yes.
I'm going to present the cycle, and then Filipe will present you, and then.
Okay. So, boa tarde a todos.
I'm speaking in Portuguese.
Okay. O ciclo de seminários Repensar os Arquivos tem como finalidade colocar o arquivo ou os arquivos entendidos como construtos sociais no centro do debate, para analisar e caracterizar as suas origens, funções, estruturas, materialidades e reutilizações na longa duração, bem como para aquilatar o impacto presente da transformação e da transição digital na construção da memória da comunidade. Neste espaço de debate que pretendemos promover, que é inter e transdisciplinar e multidisciplinar, que decorre entre outubro de 2023 e abril de 2024, pretendemos promover um encontro entre a arquivística histórica, archival science, a ciência da informação e os archival studies, no sentido de contribuir para o enriquecimento da reflexão teórica e metodológica em torno do conceito de arquivo e das suas relações com diversas áreas do saber, procurando colmatar uma necessidade que se faz sentir no panorama científico nacional. Ao ritmo de uma sessão por mês, são trazidas à discussão por investigadores de renome internacional diversas subtemáticas previamente selecionadas pelos coordenadores do ciclo. A análise e comentários de cada sessão serão efetuados por investigadores séniores do panorama português, também com projeção internacional, no sentido de contribuir para encurtar as fronteiras que possam subsistir no panorama científico global. Os textos resultantes destas sessões serão publicados em 2024 num e-book sujeito a revisão por pares, sob o título do seminário, e também eu gostaria de informar que no final deste ciclo, em maio de 2024, realizar-se-á também o Vinculum Project Archival Colloquium, cuja organização já se encontra a decorrer. Resta-me agradecer a presença do nosso conferencista. Thank you so much for coming, for being here today with us. Muito obrigado à professora Fernanda e ao professor Armando Malheiro por estarem cá. E vou passar a palavra à Filipe.
Boa tarde a todos. Nós hoje temos a honra de ter aqui connosco o professor Eric Ketelaar, que é professor emérito da Universidade de Amesterdão, que é um investigador de renome na área da ciência arquivística, que tem um vasto currículo internacional, quer na área da investigação, quer na área do ensino da arquivística, que nos traz hoje uma reflexão sobre os novos enquadramentos e horizontes epistemológicos, e teremos a honra também de ter aqui o comentário dos professores Fernanda Ribeiro e Armando Malheiro da Silva, que são ambos professores na Faculdade de Letras da Universidade do Porto e que são pioneiros na introdução, na reflexão, investigação e também formação da ciência da informação no panorama científico português. E para não prolongarmos mais esta apresentação, vamos passar a palavra a quem é mais entendido neste assunto, o professor Ketelaar, e depois os comentários dos professores Fernanda e Armando Malheiro da Silva.
Yeah. Well, good afternoon, dear colleagues and friends. I'm here to talk for the next, let's say, 45 minutes about change in archives, but also very importantly, more important, change of the archivist, his or her role, his or her mission in the digital age. And I have this quote from Spanish, Italian writing, because change is something some people are afraid of. And I will try in the coming time in this lecture to make it clear that there is no need to be afraid of change. I have a whole agenda, and you can count how many chapters I will deal with. So when we are, let's say, at the paradigm shifts, we are really at the end, nearing the end. Last May, it was 125 years since the Association of Archivists in the Netherlands published the Manual for the Arrangement and Description of Archives, the Dutch manual by Muller, Veit and Fruin. That anniversary would lend itself to a historical overview, a look back at the development of archival science in 125 years. Many authors have contributed to such a history of the profession. I will not repeat that. We can also celebrate 25 years, the 25th anniversary of your Portuguese handbook, Arquivística, Teoria e Prática, with a second edition later and a third edition even as recent as 2009. Authored by, forgive me my pronunciation, Julio Ramos, Manuel Luz Rayal, and the commentators today here, Fernanda Ribeiro and Armando Malheiro da Silva. The authors of Arquivística dedicated, as you can read, their book to the authors of the Dutch manual, who, I quote, opened new perspectives for the archival discipline. Allow me to refer to another celebration, possible celebration. It was more professional and more personal. A few days ago, it was exactly 25 years since my inaugural lecture as professor at the University of Amesterdam. I'm not going to deal with those 25 years of history either. I just want to mention a few moments in the development of archival science, not as a historiography, but as a starting point to present you some reflections on the need for changes in archival science and in the archival profession. The temporality of our profession means that, like the god Janus, we look in the present, standing in the present, working in the present, we look to the past on the one hand and to the future on the other. At least this is the traditional Western view, which I'm going to review later in this lecture. In the past 25 years, archivists have learned to look critically to their own actions and to question their own theories, methods, and practices. In my inaugural address 25 years ago, I introduced the concept of archivalization, a neologism which I invented, meaning the conscious or unconscious choice determined by social and cultural factors to consider something worth archiving. By distinguishing archivalization preceding archiving, we gain an insight into the social and cultural factors, the standards and values, the ideologies that infuse the creation of archival documents. Acknowledging archivalization means that archivists, beyond their preoccupation with the archive they manage, also look beyond the archive. This calls for looking up from the record and through the record, looking beyond and questioning its boundaries in new perspectives, seeing with the archive, to borrow Tom Nesmith's wonderful expression. Trying to read the tacit narratives of power and knowledge. This means a broadening, thus a change, of archival science and openness to contributions from anthropologists, sociologists, philosophers, culture and literary theorists, artists, and many more. These and other disciplines have experienced an archival turn in the past 25 years. The term archival turn was first used by the anthropologist and historian Anne Stoller in a paper given at a conference in St. Petersburg, May 1998. I also participated in that conference, and I quoted Stoller in my inaugural lecture later that year. The archival turn, or the move from archives as sources to archives as subject, was presented by Stoller on a number of occasions, 3 of them of the utmost importance. for the profession and for the discipline. The Sawyer Seminar, Archive, Documentation and Institutions of Social Memory, the book Refiguring the Archive, and the journal Archival Science. In 2001, the Sawyer Seminar brought some 70 scholars from 15 countries to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, United States. The participants in 28 sessions, nearly weekly. The participants came from various disciplines in the humanities and social sciences, less than 1/3 being scholars and practitioners in archivistics. Their point of departure of the seminar organizers, Frank Lewin and Bill Rosenberg, was, I quote, a conception of archives not simply as historical repositories, but as a complex of structures, processes, and epistemologies. This heralded a new view of archives as epistemological sites rather than as sources. And Stoller's 2 papers at Michigan convincingly argued for this archival term, which was visible in several other presentations in Michigan. The 2 papers by Stoller were developed into a presentation at the seminar Refiguring the Archive, hosted in 1998 by the South African University of Witwatersrand in conjunction with 4 archival institutions. The 13 sessions of that seminar attracted speakers and discussants from a wide range of disciplines. Among them were Ann Stoller and no one less than Jacques Derrida. The book you see here on the slides, Refiguring the Archive, was published in 2002. And in the introduction to the book, the editors, Carolyn Hamilton, Vern Harris, and Graham Reed, stressed the constructiveness of archives, not simply as sources, but as sites of contested knowledge. I quote, "Today, scholars pay greater attention to the particular processes by which the record was produced and subsequently shaped, both before its entry into the archives and increasingly as part of the archival record." Stoller's paper was subsequently published in the 2nd volume, 2002, of Archival Science. The journal, founded in 2001, marked the emancipation of archivistics as an autonomous scholarly discipline. The founders of the journal, their approach of archival science was a journal that would be integrated, intercultural, and interdisciplinary. Integrated because the journal would cover the whole of the records continuum. Intercultural because the journal would acknowledge the impact of different cultures on archival theory, methodology, and practice. And interdisciplinary, I would now say multidisciplinary, meant an association with the scientific disciplines dealing with, 1, the function of records and the way they are created, preserved, and retrieved. 2, the context in which information is generated, managed, and used. And thirdly, the social and cultural environment of records creation in different times and places. This hospitality to other disciplines was and still is essential. As Terry Eastwood, the Canadian colleague, wrote in 2017, I quote, "In engaging other disciplinary perspectives, archivists have augmented their theory, methods, and practice with insights not of their own making, but by no means foreign to their way of thinking. In some cases, these insights are surprising," end of quote. Surprising. But if I have to admit, sometimes staggering. In the past 25 years, much of the literature on the archive has often been received by members of the archival profession as, well, with rejection, indignation, speculation, and even amusement, because the archive seemed to them to be a misguided, misdirected, poorly understood, and overly theorized construct of a primarily practical pursuit. This narrow view has been rectified in recent years by educators and scholars in archivistics like Janet Bastian, who endeavored to reconcile the archive with the archives. Indeed, one shouldn't make a fuss over the conceptual and practical differences between the singular and the plural. Archives and archive are, as Jeffrey Yeo proposes, boundary objects which straddle many different communities of practice. Any given object could be claimed by two or more communities. The second volume of Archival Science in 2002 consisted of two thematic double issues, archives, records, and power. The guest editors, Terry Cook and John Schwartz, argued in their introduction that archives are not passive storehouses of old stuff, but active sites where social power is negotiated, contested, and confirmed. Terry Cook had, the year before, contributed to Archival Science the inaugural article, Archival Science and Postmodernism, New Formulations of Old Concepts. He ended that article by stating, and I have here the Portuguese translation point of view, process rather than product, becoming rather than being, dynamic rather than stated. Let me see if I can, these have become the postmodern watchwords for analyzing and understanding science, society, organizations, and business activity, among others. They should likewise become the watchwords for archival studies, so for archival science in a new century, and thus the foundation for a new conceptual paradigm for the profession. Such a new paradigm, not only for the profession, but for archivistics as a scholarly endeavor, was presented in the first volume of Archival Science by Fernanda Ribeiro. She realized, like Terry Cook, that archival science was reaching a turning point at which old and new perspectives coexisted. Her article confronted, I quote, the traditional and admittedly still dominant view substantiated in the historical technical paradigm, and the new approach, which we will designate as scientific information. This led, inter alia, to the design of a new curriculum for teaching information science, which abolished the separation between archives and libraries. Terry Cook's article in Archival Science dealt with the impact of postmodern ideas on archival theory. In another article published in the same year in Archivaria, Terry focused more on the societal conditions of postmodernity and how postmodern insights might improve archival practice and profession. Inspiration for this came from various thinkers and writers, both within and outside archival science. Because, to quote Terry Eastwood again, engaging other disciplinary perspectives is essential to any discipline, to theory, methodology, and practice. And we have learned how postmodernism is the realization that the so-called principles cherished by our profession, such as respect des fonds, are likewise revealed as historically contingent, not universal or absolute. Take, for example, the notion of organically structured, organically grown archives, as opposed to artificially constructed collections. The concept of a collection has been haunting archival practitioners and theorists ever since the respect des fonds was formulated in 1841 in France and codified in the Dutch Manual of 1898. The core idea of the manual was that an archive is not so much an arbitrary collection, but a whole that has arisen organically. Archives, according to the manual, are the reflection of the creator's functions and therefore not arbitrarily created in the way that historical manuscripts are accumulated. This archival logic, so many people believed, distinguishes archives from libraries and other artificial collections. That difference was obscured in the English edition of the manual because the translator replaced the Dutch archief, in Portuguese arquivo, throughout by archival collection. An archival collection became standard in American terminology to the extent that, for example, Mark Green recently would write about an archival collection. And what he meant was the archivo, archive in the European sense. So there is a confusion here between a confusion which is of a long date. The difference between organically grown archives and artificially constructed collections was effectively deconstructed by three writers from the University of Glasgow: Michael Moss, Susan Storrett, and James Correll. They wrote two articles published in 2005 and 2006. They argued that all collections in archives, libraries, and museums are constructed and mediated. The creators of a collection privilege some items to be part of the aggregation and reject, often implicitly, others. In my country, to give an example, text messages sent and received by phone by public officials are considered to be archival documents. Very recently, it became known that the Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, used to select from the text messages he received and sent the important ones. The rest he deleted every day from his phone, apparently assuming that the latter were not archival. In creating his archives, he thus privileged some text messages while rejecting others, putting some on an archival pedestal, sending others into oblivion as non-archival documents. Such privileging, Correll, Moss, and Stewart argued, is inevitably dynamic, reflecting contemporary circumstances and preoccupations. They concluded that the various stakeholders in information provision in both the physical and digital domains should, I quote, enter into meaningful dialogue, not just to quibble about semantics, but to debate the harder theoretical, technical, and philosophically problems. This presents new opportunities to us all, but threatens the carefully cherished boundaries between professions in the established order. However, accepting the socially constructed nature of collections and archives should not lead to lumping them together. The logic of the archives involves that records and archives are what Theo Thomas called process-bound, that is, they are generated by coherent work processes and structured and recorded by these work processes in such a way that the meanings of the record can be retrieved from the context of those work processes. Archival science is a contextual science, as Foscarini wrote recently. Consequently, we do not consider the record or document merely on its own, but within the context of the work process which created the document, and which gives each document its specific meaning within that context. Archiving includes creating and linking a document to a transaction and to the other documents of that transaction by some form of physical or virtual filing. The archival bond, or the interrelatedness between the records created and received in the course of a particular transaction, is an essential characteristic of archives. The process-bound character of records and archives entails, as I said, looking up from the record and through the record to its contextual agency, the why, the who, the what, and how. Archiving is a cultural, social, and political practice influenced by societal challenges, including archivalization, and by technologies, not directly, but through the agency of actors who act in a particular, according to a mandate, in a particular function. In my book, Archiving People, I proposed a model of the archival context. It is based on a model by Hans Hofmann, who adapted an Australian model. For example, starting at the top, for example, we acknowledge the need felt by society for, just an example, the need for an armed force that is anchored constitutionally, that is the mandate, the why. This results in functions, what, performed by actors who, in specific work processes, how, where, and when, and all this leads to archiving. And they are all embedded in technology. The changing views of society about this, for example, about, for instance, military service, have an influence on the military's mandate and subsequently on the functions, the enlisting system, for instance, the actors, governments, citizens, businesses, and work processes leading to changes in archiving. Each of these interdependent components is time and place bound and influenced by technology. This makes the model dynamic, the more so when we realize that archiving in a model stands for the records continuum, wherein archival documents travel back and forth in a recursive process across 4 dimensions: creation, capture, organization, and pluralization, which is making the records available to society. Therefore, the model is embedded in various temporalities. Why, who, what, and how will change. And creation, capture, organization, and pluralization will change. And societal challenges and technology will change. In this vision, the provenance of archives is linked to functions and activities over time and through time, rather than to structure and place. Provenance is one of the traditional tenets or principles in archivistics. However, a new wave of theorizing the concept of provenance, according to a recently published call for papers of a special issue of Archival Science on provenance, and the authors then suggest that the archival field continues to explore and reinterpret both the affordances and inadequacies of what is generally considered a foundational principle. An earlier wave of rediscovering provenance was marked 20 years ago by the publication of Canadian archival studies and the rediscovery of provenance, edited by Tom Nesmith. Some years later, Nesmith proposed a new concept of provenance. The provenance, I quote here, the provenance of a given record or body of records consists of the social and technical processes of the record's inscription, transmission, contextualization, and interpretation, which account for its existence, characteristics, and continuing history. Many scholars and practitioners are working with provenance in various conceptualizations of the tenet. Peter Rossman said in 2011, more conceptually, provenance is now rather defined as context, or rather contexts, plural, what Vern Harris calls an ever-unfolding horizon of contexts. There is a risk, however, that in this incessant movement of continual recontextualization, so context, the boundaries of provenance become infinite, and that meaningful distinction between the various parties who concur in the formation of a group of records over time and the role they play may be obscured as Jennifer Douglas recently wrote. She advocates acknowledging the ways in which each of these types of intervention differs from each other in their motives, methods, and eventual impacts. And this calls for more research, both on each of the components of my model, of the archival context, and on their interdependencies and their relative value. So in fact, the model suggests that it is static, but it is dynamic, and we have to research the various components and the dynamism more. One of the operationalizations of this view of provenance defined as context is the conceptual model records in contexts, note the plural, of or RIC, currently being developed by the International Council on Archives. And we have already a political study of the RIC. This RIC model is meant to replace older standards like IZG. The model recognizes that the contexts in which archival materials arise and are used over time are dynamic and complex. The model proposes a way of contextual description in order to offer different perspectives and different access options. According to RIC, the description of an archival item makes the network of relations of related actors, documents, functions, and processes, and their contextual history transparent. Among these actors are not only record creators and archivists, but a host of what I call archivers. That's everyone who has contributed to the record and has been affected by its action, to quote Livia Jakovina, who advocates a participant model of provenance along the lines of earlier proposals by Chris Hurley and others. As I argued at the Sawyer seminar, and subsequently in my tacit narrative, 2001, I quote, every interaction, intervention, interrogation, and interpretation by creator, user, and archivist is an activation of the record. This is echoed in the new RFC model. I quote, ongoing use and reuse of the records becomes part of the history of the records. It recontextualizes them. The use and reuse generate other records, thereby extending the social document network. The same is true for the use and reuse by record subjects, their communities, and other co-creators. But as Jessica Leff argues, not all record interventions can be reduced or elevated to the level of co-creation. She refers to Michel Caswell's refusal to position prisoners of the Khmer Rouge as co-creators of their photographic prison record, suggesting that to do so would position victims of the Khmer Rouge as somehow complicit in their trauma, abuse, and murder. Nonetheless, and I just saw some of the files created here under the Salazar regime, which are also the mugshots of people who were arrested by the secret and not so secret police. So we have to be very careful in how we deal with the record subjects, even if they are dead, or maybe more specifically when they are dead, and not throw them out on the street and say, well, it's now 50 years since. No, they deserve a special treatment, the record subjects, be it prisoners or patients in hospital or whatever. So we have to recognize the rights of co-creators as part of an archive's provenance. It is also a first step towards decolonizing archival theory, methodologies, and practices. Decolonizing being, to my mind, one of the greatest challenges to the archival profession today and tomorrow. Postmodern views have led archival scholars to repudiate the assumption that archival documents are static, unchangeable, and fixed. They are shaped by the decisions and actions of their originators and custodians. I will deal later with the fixity of digital records. The Australian records continuum, which I showed earlier, the model implies that an archival document, by traveling throughout the continuum, is created and recreated, getting different meanings along the way. This is called by Helen McNeil archive alterity, which refers to the acts of continuous and discontinuous change that transform the meaning and authenticity of a performance as it is transmitted over time and space. This challenges archival theory and methodology to displace or at least change traditional conceptualizations of records and archives. I may refer to the important work of international multidisciplinary research networks like Interpares and Record DNA. Most archivists would keep to the traditional definition of records as information created, received, and maintained as evidence and information, etc. This circular definition, information is information, so that's not a real definition. In the international standard ISO 15489 was amended later into information created, received, and maintained as evidence and as an asset by an organization or person. Both the original and the revised definition of records have been scrutinized by Jeffrey Yeo in his remarkable book, Records, Information and Data, exploring the role of record keeping in an information culture, the fruit of many years of thinking and writing about records and archives. In 2007, Yeo proposed that information is not an entity that can be managed as such. Information, he writes, is one of the properties, or in his terminology, affordances of a record, a capacity that records can supply to a user, or a benefit that can be derived from the user, Evidence is another affordance of records. So are affordances values like memory, accountability, legitimation of power, a sense of personal social identity and continuity, and the communication of such benefits across space and time. These affordances and potentials are waiting to be activated and to give meaning to a record. A record doesn't have a meaning. The meaning is assigned by the reader, by the user, by the archivist. Different meanings are assigned to the same resource by different people at different times, as Jonathan Ferner wrote. And he added that the conventional meaning of a given resource is a matter of intersubjective consensus. This approach brings the user and their meaning making to the forefront. You see, we are moving to the end. Allow me a personal note here. In 1979, the chair of archivistics at the University of Amesterdam was transferred from the history department to book, library, and information studies, which was then renamed into library, archives, and information studies. I lost the battle to have the alphabetical order, which would have put archivistics in the first place, and then the others. I lost that battle. But archives and information studies were later moved to the newly created Department of Media Studies. And there I discovered how colleagues working with television, film, journalism, and new media were primarily interested in the reception of media and the interaction with readers and viewers, more than in the production. And that opened my eyes to paying more attention in archival studies to the user as co-creator and to archiving as a human practice. People are involved in day-to-day acts of classification, arrangement, selection, etc. Everyone at some point in his or her life has arranged a bookshelf or have used a mobile phone to capture mass images or throwing away the receipt of the restaurant where you dined last year. These are practically archiving practices. Media scholar and artist Jacob Smollett proposes the concept of para-archiving. And that's a practice performed on a personal level by an amateur and dilettante who traditionally are not considered colleagues by archivists. No, that is just personal use. No, any human being and even some animals are involved in informational and archiving practices. We are, in fact, all archivists. Recently, Anne Klein, professor at Laval University in Quebec, has proposed a Copernican turn in archival theory and practice. She states, archives become truly archives only through their utilization. She advocates rethinking archives from the point of view of their exploitation rather than from their production. She amends the record continuum model by adding exploitation as a fifth dimension. This proposal to bring the exploitation of archives and thus the use of the user of archives to the forefront is in line with other recent paradigmatic changes in archival theory, methodology, and practice. One was labeled Archives 2.0, an approach in which archivists use technology to become more user-centered. Another, the remove towards archival autonomy. This is a concept recently proposed by Australian scholars, being the ability for individuals and communities to participate in societal memory with their own voice, becoming participatory agents in record keeping and archiving. Viewing archives as participatory frameworks is broadening into a view of archives as part of an ecology, a term I use to stress the interdependence, mutuality, and coexistence of archives and records and other memory texts in a societal context. Actors in that ecology are the archivers I mentioned before. But not all archivers are equal in the deeply social world of the archive, as sociologists, recently two sociologists like Nicholas Wilson found out. In the relationship between scholars, users, and archivists, these scholars write, vectors of inequality may be hidden. They are instances of power, and indeed every interaction with the archive by an archiver is intentionally or unintentionally enforced by power. Archive in the 21st century studies phenomena that look like traditional facts and events, even carry traditional labels, but are conceptually totally different. An original is no original. A record is not a record. Provenance, preservation, access, and use are no provenance, preservation, access, and use as we used to know them. Digital records don't have their content, structure, and form in or on a physical medium. They are potential documents coming into existence only by virtue of software that understands how to access and display them. The software sooner or later becomes obsolete, which necessitates refreshing the documents through migration or other techniques. The perceptible form of a digital document is always being manufactured just in time on the spot. This makes a digital document an ephemeral, fluid manifestation. The same is true for digital instantiations of works of art, digital born or digitized analog materials. I argue that preserving an artwork or an archival document means enacting it by capturing the ephemeral, drawing on the reserves embedded in the originating instantiation of the work at the inception. Further instantiations are what the people at the Rhizome Digital Archive call variants. They will not and cannot be exact copies. They are approximations, if only because the public is not the same as in earlier performances. This makes the distinction between original and copy irrelevant to those concerned with performance and liveness, as Nash and Ball argue with regard to digital performance artwork, but it would be also true for digital documents. Ephemerality. Archives are comprised in their continuing and future enactment and use in layers of performance. They are not static. They are constantly refreshed so that their ephemerality endures, to quote Wendy Chun. This enduring ephemerality has been tested, for example, by the Australian Circus Oz Living Archive, founded in 2014 and revived in 2022. This living archive, and there are other examples, is not merely a digital repository. It is a dynamic part of the mediated enactment of design in and as cultural imagination and articulation. The Circus Oz Living Archive is one example of the endeavors to preserve works of art by enactment, rather than by freezing a particular instantiation, which traditionally has been seen as a characteristic of the archive. Artists and archivists have to become more permissive of change of the work of art and the archive, more permissive of the ephemeral performance of art and archive. Anna Decker signals that changing attitudes towards archiving are increasingly focused on ephemerality and require strategies of modulation, movement, and mutation. The editors of the book Artists in the Archive define archiving as giving place, order, and future to the remainder. The double meaning of remainder, usually Parika writes, is that which is left behind as an enduring legacy that is archived, but also that which is left out of the classification or the archive. Indeed, archives are a residue left after the non-archivable has been removed. Think of the Prime Minister of the Netherlands and his mobile phone. Archiving entails appraisal, which is distinguishing records of continuing value from those of no further value, so that the latter may be eliminated. Appraisal is one of those interventions which co-determine the meaning of archives, because the archives after appraisal are not anymore the same as the archive before appraisal. In the digital age, the appraisal process begins with the design of the record-keeping system, when one determines which documents are captured, that is, accepted by the system, and thus becoming records. Moreover, digital records cannot be left on the shelves for years, waiting to be appraised. Therefore, at the front end, one has to decide which documents have to be kept in the system as records, and which records can be disposed of later, either through destruction or by transferring them to another system. Archiving by design means that when designing the information systems that support work processes, one has to take into account the sustainability of the information from those work processes. Sustainability implies acting that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The major change in the 21st century and the major challenge for the archival endeavor, I propose, is the existential threat from climate change, global warming, requiring an urgent switch to sustainability, in particular environmental sustainability, in all areas of archival practice. Much of the as yet scarce literature on archives and climate change concerns the receiving end, that is, the threat to archives of climate change. But equally and perhaps more important is to look at the producing end. How much is archiving contributing to global warming through emission of greenhouse gases? Last July, a special issue of COMA, the Journal of the International Council on Archives, was devoted to archives and climate change. It contains, among others, an in-depth study by Aurélie Nicolet and Basma Chabou on the ecological costs of our archival practices. Every time you open the door for a reader, every time you switch on and off the light in the repository, the archive creates gases, needs energy. That energy is a salt on our planet. In my country, the impact on climate change, the National Archives, the Netherlands, has been calculated as nearly 4,000 ton CO2 equivalent, which is just as much as the emission of 204 Dutch households. Nearly all of that footprint, 87%, is caused by IT and data storage, plus energy, another 8%, 9%. Reducing emissions and energy consumption are the key solutions to tackle global warming and its effects, loss of biodiversity, forest fires, sea level rise, etc. Archival workers, Samantha Wynne writes, have both an ethical imperative and a functional exigency to develop practices which do not require infinite exploitable resources. As the Code of Ethics of the Archives and Records Association of the UK and Ireland states, I quote, insofar as it is within their power to do so, members should minimize the adverse effects of their work on the environment. In 2019, the American archivist published an extensive report towards environmentally sustainable digital preservation, which not only includes a thorough literature review, but importantly offers a roadmap for strategies to reduce the environmental impact of digital archival practices. Even more important and more difficult are the report's recommendations to re-evaluate the archivist's basic assumptions of appraisal, permanence, and availability of digital content. Such a re-evaluation is urgent. Cultural heritage organizations, the authors argue, need to reduce the amount of digital content that they preserve, while reducing the resource intensity of its storage and delivery. That entails a number of paradigm shifts. The first paradigm shift concerns appraisal. Some people assume that appraisal of records, what to keep and what to destroy, is no longer necessary in the digital age because of the unlimited storage capacity and searchability of digital media. That is, however, a myth. Enduring storage and enduring access require enormous resources, buildings, staff, energy, constant upgrading and migration of software and hardware, etc. Every terabyte less as a result of appraisal is not only a saving in these annual recurring costs, but more importantly, a reduction of the archive's carbon footprint. To reduce the environmental impact, archival institutions have to develop additional criteria alongside existing principles for selection and appraisal. Pendergrass and his co-authors formulate questions like, is there a demonstrated need for digital availability of the analog materials? Do you need to preserve all copies of a digital record? Or an easy question, do you need to preserve the analog original that has been digitized? Should every item be migrated or digitized to the highest quality possible? The second paradigm shift, signaled by Pendergrass and his co-authors, concerns permanence. They challenge the authors the assumption in current digital preservation practice of a goal of zero change or loss in digital collections over time. and they urge archival institutions to determine acceptable levels of loss in digital preservation programs. As Jeff Rotenberg wrote 2 decades ago in a report commissioned by the Dutch National Archives, we must choose what to lose. Instead of striving for permanence, archivists should decide what constitutes good enough digital preservation, using terms as continuing or enduring. Perhaps the rhetoric of the archive should move away from notions of fixed, stable records and embrace, it's a new word, lossiness, so embrace that you lose information. Furthermore, improving the efficiency of preservation practices, for example, reducing the frequency of fixity checks. Do you have a fixity check of the digital media every week, every 2 weeks, every month? So that is a matter for risk management. What are the risks of this certain lossiness? In any case, it must lead and it will lead to the storage of less data and thus reducing the storage footprint. The third and final paradigm shift proposed in the report relates to availability. Users expect near constant and immediate access, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, permanent, to any and all digital-born and digitized material. But they usually do not realize that retrieving files from a digital collection causes CO2 emissions. The footprint of the archive service grows with every action in which its service uses computing power, and also with the loading of web pages and the downloading of files. So instead of being proud of the number of digital records you put on the internet, we should consider less impact on by having less put free on the internet. Culture changes. Culture heritage organization can reduce the environmental impact of digital access and delivery by critically examining the justification for mass digitization, implementing on-demand access strategies rather than just put it all on the internet and the user will come. No, try to tailor the presence on the internet, adjusting storage technologies for access and ensuring timely but not necessarily immediate delivery. Some of these 3 paradigm shifts regarding appraisal, permanence, and availability entails changes in archival science and the archival profession. Each of these paradigm shifts calls for theoretical and methodological revisiting of canonical principles and practices. They were once conceived and adopted. They are not imminent and immobile. On the contrary, in the longer term, they are variable and changeable. This offers room for agency, for evolution, and often also for revolutionary changes in archival principles and practices. Changes that are often the consequence of changes in society and in technology. Opposing those changes with an appeal to tradition, it has always been like that, so why change? No, that's a bad tactic. This also applies to an appeal to law or to professional ethics. That is not allowed. After all, the rules of the law and professional conduct were created by people who acted in a certain environment at a certain time for a certain purpose. Archivistics as a scholarly and professional endeavor, too, is not imminent and immobile. It moves through time and space, adapting, inhaling, and infusing from other disciplines. Archivistics has profited from positivism, structuralism, postmodernism, from scholarship in historiography, in history, anthropology, critical race theory, social, etc., etc. Archivistics is being enriched by feminist, queering, and post-colonial methodologies and epistemologies. which are a powerful means of addressing the tenets of Western archival scholarship. There are the returns offered by those other disciplines, returning what they learned from us and new perspectives, endowing and changing archival theory, methodology, and practice. Everything flows and nothing stays, Heraclitus said. No person ever steps in the same river twice. And so I am back at the beginning. If we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change. I have dealt, ladies and gentlemen, with a number of changes. The first was the new way of looking at and beyond the record, trying to read its tacit narratives of power and knowledge, and taking into account archival alterity, which refers to the acts of continuous and discontinuous change that transformed the meaning and authenticity of a font as it is transmitted over time and space. This means a broadening, thus a change of archival science and an openness to contributions from other disciplines. Looking beyond the record brings the context of archiving to the forefront, the why, the who, the what, and the how, embedded in various temporalities. Context will change, and creation, capture, organization, and pluralization will change, and societal challenges will change, and technology will change. So why don't we change as well? Major changes in archival theory, methodology, and practices are affected by bringing the exploitation of archives, and thus the user of archives, to the forefront. This is in line with other recent changes, such as viewing archives as participatory frameworks and acknowledging archival autonomy. Another change is viewing archives as part of an ecology to stress the interdependence, mutuality, and coexistence of archives and records and other memory texts in a societal context. I have argued that archivists have to become more permissive of change of the archive, more permissive of the ephemeral performance of the archive. Before closing, I want to return to climate change and time. Climate change endangers the archivist's core mission to steward records and archives for the benefit of present and future generations. In a non-linear time framework, is the past never past. It is never over, as trauma victims know all too well. The past is present in the here and now. Time future is contained in time past, as T.S. Eliot wrote. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. These words could serve as a motto of records continuum thinking, wherein, as I said, archival documents have no single temporality, but travel in time back and forth. They are configured and refigured through space-time. Once written or spoken, they enter past time and can only be understood from present time in a non-linear but recursive sequence, not separating past, present, and future. Derrida writes, the archive he writes that every interpretation of the archive is an enrichment, an extension of the archives. That is why the archive is never closed. It opens out of the future. End of quote. The archive is not just a sheltering of the past. It is, in Derrida's words, an anticipation of the future. And that future has already begun. Thank you very much. Change of actors.
Thank you so much for this inspiring presentation, Professor Ketelaar. And now I kindly ask Professor Fernanda Ribeiro and Professor Armando Malheiro to come join us and to make the comments in the lecture.
Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank the organization of this seminar, the invitation to participate in this interesting session with a distinguished colleague, Professor Eric Ketelaar, who I know for a long time. As far as I remember, I knew Professor Ketelaar in Amsterdam around 1999, 2000, a time when I was participating in a European project named ETERM, European Training in Electronic Records Management, in which the Dutch Archive School, I don't know how to pronounce in Dutch, was also a partner. And later on we met other times, but I remember especially a moment when we met in Finland, in Tampere, in a doctoral seminar, and we had an amazing experience of a sauna party somewhere in the middle of a forest, and I will never forget that special moment. And it was many years ago, more than 10 surely, and since then I follow Professor Ketelaar's work, but I suppose we didn't met since then. But let's come back to the topic. Professor Ketelaar, I'll follow some notes, not to lose my speech, but so as I was telling, Professor Ketelaar provided us with a remarkable text, a kind of trip along archivists, which is indicates the title indicates is an evocation that celebrates changes in archival discipline over the last 25 years. Curiously, the time, as we said, when the book Arquivística, Teoria e Prática de uma Ciência de Informação, from which we both are co-authors, which the professor gently evoked, and also the time Eric entered as teacher in the University of Amesterdam. In fact, in the last 25 years, we have witnessed a lot of significant changes in the discipline. And I would say that above all, we saw an emphasis on theorization that was not so evident before, and above all, it didn't constitute a concern for so many academics as we see in the last 2 decades. Certainly, these theoretical concerns are related to the fact that the discipline has achieved an academic status that hadn't before, because there are a lot of programs in the universities, a lot of people working academically, like doing research, and this makes a big difference, because during many time we know that we have a discipline that came from the practice. The practice came before the theory. So this deepening of and this development of theorization, of course, make a difference. And the research, as I said, in this field began to develop itself and deepen with a view towards scientificity of this area. And I think this is a characteristic that we can emphasize for this last decades. Of course, previously we had Elio Lodolini and Hilary Jenkinson or Schellenberg, Carlo Laroche, Michel Duchamp, and many others. And we can also mention actions of the International Council on Archives and the Bureau of Canadian Archivists and the important work of Michael Cook in the United Kingdom, just to refer some examples. But I would say that all followed a line that we can classify as traditional. It was a search for defining some theories, some principles, thinking over the practice, but in the same line without these terms that the professor mentioned today. From the end of the 90s, and mainly since that time, and curiously, at the turn of the century, like happens at the end of the 19th century, when the Dutch archivists published what has been called the Manual of Dutch Archivists. At the end of the 19th century, we also assisted to a third in archivistics. And at that time, I think the most significant was that archivists attempt to separate from the statute of the auxiliary discipline of history and started to become more autonomous. And the manual of Dutch archivists has importance because of that. At the end of the 20th century, perhaps the journal Archival Science also means a turn, this time towards the affirmation of archivists as archival science, defending autonomy, the scientific autonomy of the discipline and the word science. Joining with archival has this meaning. And so Professor Ketelaar highlighted these terms, and I believe we could summarize them quickly, stating the main ones. I'm not putting in an order of importance, but an aleatory order. That different aspects that I can point as the most important for the discipline, as for example, the openness to interdisciplinary or even multidisciplinarity, the understanding of archives as social memory, a focus on the record's life cycle against the theory of 3 ages that separates different stages of the archives, and the idea of records continuum, a complete life cycle from the production to the permanent archives. Then we have also the postmodernist conceptions, as the professor highlighted, process rather than product, becoming rather than being, dynamic rather than static, context rather than text, reflecting time and place rather than universal absolutes. Also the focus on the notion of organicity, on the organic, and I emphasize this in a certain way as opposite of arbitrary collections. And this is an issue that we can bring to the debate, because I think you can discuss if there are in fact arbitrary collections, or a collection is not so organic as the production of a personal archive. So I let this for the debate. Archival science as a contextual science, the idea of Theo Thomason, and the importance of the process bound, including records and archives. An idea and a perspective that also inspires the integrated archival science in Canada, and influence even Portugal and a lot of people here. And in Portugal, for us, in fact, we have something that is a facilitator, because differently from the Anglo-Saxon terminology, we don't have records and archives. We don't say documents and archives. We say the word arquivo in Portuguese. It serves us for everything, but on the other, it's the same in Dutch. But on the other side, there is another. Arquivo is a polysemic term, because we call arquivo as the set of documents produced for someone or an institution or organization along his life and his activity. And we call also arquivo the repository, the service, the institution that collects the archivos documents produced by anyone. And so there is a confusion sometimes, because when we mention arquivo, it's not the first time a word that has only one meaning, so it causes some problems. And another point is, I think it's important, is the review of the notion of provenance, now more linked to the idea of functions and activities. We would say, in our perspective, systemic approach and an organic and functional analysis to understand the context of production and use of information. Our perspective is very much focused on this idea of the organicity and the functionality of the archives, and this context, organic context, is determinant to understand the production and how the documents are produced and are used, because the producer is at the same time a user of the information, and is the determinant in all the life of the documents. The idea also as information as evidence, and the issue of appraisal and the definition of societal criteria for appraisal. I think I've put down a lot of the main or the most important points that we can debate and discuss, but I would also explain another thing. All these theoretical approaches are, or most of them, consensual for us. There are a lot of things that are so obvious that there is no way not to agree. Why not? Of course, no? But perhaps the main divergence, we both, it's not an opposition, it's a perspective. We are in science, we can have different perspectives. I think it's very useful to discuss and to debate ideas. The main divergence has to do with the consideration of archivists, and you notice that I never said archival science, always archivists. The consideration of archivistics as an autonomous science. We consider that it is an applied discipline integrated in information science, the main science we consider information science, and it's not an autonomous science because it has to do with the object of study and work. If we consider that our object of study and work is information and not the archives, because the archives can be more than one thing, there is no thickness to consider archivists as a single science. And so we consider that there is the same object and the same method, but dealing with specific contexts and specific services, of course. And because of that, I think we have some different approach, I would say, more internal to the discipline and not an external or sociological or other kind of societal approach. What makes a substantial difference when we try to know, to understand, and to explain information, informational or archival processes, such as the production, the use, the appraisal, the access to information. Because we do that from the point of view of the producer and user, and their informational interests, either for management, dealing with organic issues, such as evidence of acts or actions, or either for keeping the institutional or organizational memory. Looking this way, we consider that the social memory is built upon the sum of the individual, organizational, or institutional memories. And I think this perspective puts here some difference, because if we look to the information and analyze information as our object of study, for example, in the question of appraisal, we have an approach that considers information from an internal point of view. And when I say internal, I'm thinking about the producer. We consider that is determinant, and it gives us more objectivity, because if we are, for example, doing appraisal, looking from outside, thinking of social memory, thinking of research, thinking of external uses of information, this external view can change with time, with moods, with concerns, and there is less objectivity as far as the science can be reach the objectivity. So I think I've passed my time. I left these issues. I'm sure Armando will follow my my issues. So.
Okay. Por aqui. Good afternoon, Professor. I am not the pleasure of meet you. Never, I think before. I start to. Excuse me my bad English, and the person that are here and know me, they know that I usually I am fluent in exposition and defense of my ideas, but in English it's not possible. So I will be brief. My colleagues say a lot of things that I share, obviously, but I have read your paper. It's interesting. The title is the first thing interesting here. I will say that, in my point of view, it's possible to changing more archival science but this is a matter of discussion, obviously. Because the problem that my colleague in the part of hand of his final part of intervention, ajuda-me, faz bem. Final part of this intervention, say that the problem of the relationship between archival science and information science nowadays is more and more pertinent, because we see what happens. I don't will speak about artificial intelligence, because nowadays all people speak about artificial intelligence, but the digital technology is in our lives and is a challenge, a serious challenge for us. So the problem is, it's possible if some disciplines like archival, library, and museology can stay alone or maintain an autonomy, if it's possible thinking for these disciplines interdisciplinary dynamic, that is to put together and contribution together with some strong concept that they have. For instance, the idea of the concept of context. You emphasize very well this concept. It's very important. And this, in my point of view, a strong contribution from the archival science to the information science, for instance, because all information have a context, I think. So other problem is the concept of record. I think this is possible some reductionism. Why I say that? Because in affordance here in your text, you put record as the information not as an entity, but a property of record. If we characterize or define information like a set of mental and emotional representations, human and social, naturally, codified and modulated by social interaction, and that can be registered in any kind of support and can be shared of multiple forms. If you understand information of this manner, the record is a consequence of information, I will say. But this is a point to discuss, naturally, but it's not the inverse. But information is not also an entity. Information defined from this form is attached to a phenomenon, but not information. We can confuse information, and there are many people that made a confusion when speak about information. This thermodynamics, biological information, all is information. When I speak or think in information, I am modest and I think exclusively in a human and social phenomenon that nos involve together. That is not our subject, our focus. And if it's that, record, the books, the audiovisual materials, administrative papers, they have information. And our mission is to understand the context of the nature of the origin of this information, see like the producers organize this information for using, and how we can, and the archivists traditionally enter here, put or give access to this information for people. But I agree with you that archives or the information science must also understand the social, political, ideological factors. But these social, political, and ideological factors, they not appear in archives. They appear in the production, in the context. All contexts are determined by the social and political and economical and psychological and political factors. It is important to know that, because the positivism are thinking that, or they, the legacy of positivism was a documentary set, or the archives neutral. The documents bring us the truth. Is ingenuidade, ingenuity, a big ingenuity. And the postmodernism and the relativists, they have the merit to disconstruct, like Derrida, this ingenuity. But the scientist of informational archives is not a sociologist or a historian in principle. They have other focus, is understand that, but following the process. I agree that information, the object of archival inside the information science is the process, the cycle of the cycle life of information that is produced, organized, and stored, and used, and transformed for another process, because it is cycle and elliptical. That is continuous. The continuum is also a big and good concept. The continuum is that. But here there is some concept that I'm like. Others, I think that we can submit to a more changing, I will say, is my comment.